ominous sounding, isn't it? Okay, for some reason the computer won't let me share my PowerPoint. Well, that's too bad. Okay, well. And no one else has signed on onto the Zoom meeting. So it looks like it's just the three of us. So 4 of us. How you doing, Seth? Okay, so how's everyone doing? Good, good. And where did we leave off last time?
Parliament shutting down trade.
Parliament shutting down trade. Okay. Why did Parliament shut down trade?
Because of Boston, how they stalled the tea ships.
Stalled the tea ships? Or?
They like kept them there.
And then what happened with the tea?
They destroyed it.
They destroyed it. Okay, thank you. Yeah, I was worried that I made it clear what happened. This biggest act of civil disobedience in the 18th century, with peaceful disobedience, I should say. Good. Okay, so they destroy the tea. Parliament shuts down the port and also suspends the government, sends a new governor, and the new governor is Thomas Gage, who is the commander of British military forces in North America. So kind of a lot happening. And so for Boston, really a number of big questions as a result of this. You know, Parliament has shut down trade and the port and suspended the government. There no longer can be town meetings. The town meetings actually gave people in Massachusetts more power than anyone else in the British Empire had over their own affairs. the town meetings chose the sheriffs, the tax collectors, just about every public official was chosen by the town meetings. And now the town meetings are suspended. And the result of this is, and it's going to be really a thing that only fairly recently people have realized, it is that brings a lot of the towns that previously had thought Boston was really out of line. That is, you have these wacky people in Boston demonstrating and so on, and just generally causing trouble. In fact, let's just back up. Peter Oliver. Does anyone remember Peter Oliver? So what do you remember, Amber? Here.
Sorry, I'm looking back to what I wrote. I remember the name.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
He was the judge who refused to refuse the salary.
Yes, yes. That he's the judge who says, I'll take the salary. And he had done other things to irritate the local patriots. He wrote a book on the Revolution in 1778 or so, when he is in exile in England. Just not to give away the story, but on March 17th of 1776, the British forces leave Boston, and Peter Oliver and about 1,100 other loyalists go with them. Okay, and in England, he writes a book explaining what happened. And his explanation for what happened is this. In Boston, you had a handful of people like Samuel Adams, James Otis, and they absolutely hate Thomas Hutchinson. They want to get rid of Thomas Hutchinson, and they are able, because they have so much influence with the Sons of Liberty, these local mobs, to stir up all this trouble in Boston, and they will bring down the whole British system as a way of getting rid of Thomas Hutchinson. That's his explanation for what happened. And there's a certain degree of plausibility to it. That is, they did hate Thomas Hutchinson. It's almost a pathological detesting of poor Thomas Hutchinson. By the way, do you remember if Oliver and Hutchinson had any kind of a relationship?
Brothers-in-law?
They're brothers-in-law, yeah. And plus, Oliver's grandson married Thomas Hutchinson's daughter. So close family relationship. And so he sees this, that Boston is the problem. And the problem in Boston is that Oliver, or that Otis and Adams really hate Thomas Hutchinson. Now, when, as you'll recall, when he refused to refuse the salary, he goes off to impanel a court session in Worcester, and people there won't sit in a court under him because he's been impeached. So it's not entirely true, because there is this similar feeling in other parts of the province. But what we also know is there are a lot of places where people weren't unhappy with British rule. In fact, just to jump ahead a little bit, in April of 1776, the Massachusetts, okay, I'll just back up so this will try to make some sense. You have General Gage coming to be the governor. And Gage is going to appoint a new council to advise the governor. You'll recall that the charter says the governor represents the crown, the assembly represents the towns, and then the assembly would choose a council, 25 people, who would advise the governor. The governor can veto who is on the council. But when the British government suspends this charter in 1774, in the wake of the destruction of the tea, they say, okay, no more of this council chosen by the assembly. Now the governor gets to choose who is on the council to advise him. And the assembly isn't going to have that much power anymore. And what happens is Gage, well, two things. Well, more than two things have happened. One thing Gage wants to do is call for the government to meet in Salem, thinking that Boston is really too rebellious, so it would be safer for everyone if the assembly doesn't meet in Boston, but instead meets in Salem. So he tells the assembly that had been elected, come on up to Salem. And they do in June of 1774. The assembly meets in Salem, and the first thing they want to do is appoint delegates to go to a Continental Congress. Massachusetts realizes its government has been shut down. It would really be helpful to have the other colonies meeting together with us so that they can help us out. It's kind of a risky move because maybe the other colonies will say, you people in Massachusetts have really brought this on yourselves. They're electing delegates to go to this Continental Congress, and Gage says no, he doesn't want them to have delegates to a Continental Congress. So he sends the secretary to suspend the assembly, and so this poor secretary, does anyone know the name of the secretary of the province? This is kind of I'm sorry to ask you this, and I don't want to make you feel bad. You don't remember the name of the secretary of the province, Thomas Flucker. Mr. Flucker goes to suspend the assembly, and the assembly locks him out. They won't let him in. And while they're inside the assembly room, they are electing delegates to go to this Congress. And then, of course, once they leave, the governor has suspended the assembly, so they're not in session anymore. And now the governor will appoint a council, people who will advise him. And these are going to be people more sympathetic to General Gage and the British government than to the Massachusetts Charter. But what also happens is the assembly is no more, but people in all of the towns of Massachusetts say, you know, maybe Boston did step out of line, but how come we've lost the power to govern ourselves? So they elect people to be their representatives in not a provincial assembly, because that's no longer in operation, but a provincial Congress. And General Gage is now in Boston with British ships and British troops. So this provincial Congress is not going to meet in Boston. It's going to meet out in Watertown or Concord or some other town. So essentially what you have by the fall of 1774 in Massachusetts is two separate governments operating. One has General Gage, who has the commission from the king to be the governor of Massachusetts, and the other is this provincial Congress chosen by the towns of Massachusetts, and they simply say, okay, we are operating under the old charter, the office of governor is vacant, and so you have essentially two governments in operation. The towns are sending delegates here, Gage is appointing counselors to advise him. And Gage also realizes that people in the towns of Massachusetts are collecting weapons. Each town has a militia force. This is the basic defense force of the province. You know, Boston has several different militia companies. If you're a man between the ages of 16 and 60, one of your civic obligations is to perform militia service. If there is some danger, all of the men between 16 and 60 are part of militia companies. And typically, you know, it'll be up to various people in the town to start a company. It's not like suddenly there's a danger, hey, go call all the guys between 16 and 60. We want them to have some practice at this. So the custom has become every year in June or in sometime in May or June, there is a militia muster in every town. By the way, the first Monday in June, you can still see the oldest militia company in the country having a parade on Boston Common electing their officers. This is the Ancient and Honorable Artillery Company founded in the 1630s. Okay, so you as a guy, Seth, you're between 16 and 60? Okay, good. So Seth would go to this muster. He would have a weapon. He would have to show that it could fire. And then, he'll be part of a company. Typically, there will be some person in the town who'll say, hey, you know what? I'll pay for uniforms for people. I'll have 30 guys in my unit, and they'll elect him to be their captain. You, as another thing you get to do as a member of the militia is choose your officers. And so the officers are elected, and often they're elected because they've provided uniforms or done other things. And another popular thing to do to get elected a captain in the militia, aside from demonstrating that you have some capacity for this, is there anything in particular you can think of that guys between 16 and 60 might like to do when they get together on a day in the spring? Drink, yeah, so you'll provide alcohol, okay. So these militia musters, when there's peacetime, do involve firing your weapon, parading around, electing your officers, and drinking. Now, the militia had done a lot of service. Remember, there had been wars going on pretty much constantly between 1690 and the early 1760s. There hasn't been a war now for about 14 years. Now, there are other militia companies while we're on the subject. I mentioned the Ancient and Honorable Artillery Company. And when Faneuil Hall reopens, if you go to the top floor, that's where their armory is. They have a museum there. You can see their weapons, okay? There's also the First Corps of Cadets. The First Corps of Cadets, their commander is John Hancock. And there also is the First Artillery Company in Boston. And their commander, or one of their officers, had been Henry Knox. So you have a number of these different militia companies in Boston. Other towns may have several, because one thing that happens in a town, surprisingly enough, people don't get along with each other. So there may be people in the town, Seth, that wouldn't want to be in someone else's company, or there may be people who wouldn't want to be in your company. We'll make you the officer since you're here. And so you have different military companies here in Massachusetts, and each town also, the men have to provide their weapons, but if there's going to be some kind of a crisis, you're not going to want to have every guy scrounging around for gunpowder and things. So the towns have powder houses to store their gunpowder. And these are stone buildings. There are still some of them around. There's one actually in Somerville or Medford, kind of a stone building shaped like this. There's no windows, and this is where you would store powder. And Gage knows that these people are storing powder in these various powder houses. So he learns that it's then part of Charlestown. Well, it's Charlestown. Now it's part of Medford, Somerville. There is a powder house where he knows powder is being stored. So this is in September of 1774, and Gage sends an expedition up the Mystic River to go and seize the powder at this powder house. They go up by boat, get the powder, bring it back up to Boston so that the militia companies in that area won't be able to fight. Now, this really took the Patriots by surprise. And the next day, word goes around that not only had Gage seized the powder, but when people in the area tried to resist, the soldiers fired on them. It was terrible. And so this gets people really upset. And a mob assembles in Cambridge near Harvard Square, actually in Harvard Square. And this mob wants to march into Boston and attack the troops. And someone persuades them that that would be really a bad idea, because of course the troops are better armed than they are. And so instead of attacking the troops, these folks go down to Brattle Street in Cambridge, which is known now as Tory Row. One of the people living there is one of the folks who's been appointed a counselor by General Gage. His name also happens to be Oliver, though he's not related to these Olivers. They attack his house. And he flees into Boston, and other people who want to remain loyal to the crown in a place like Cambridge realize they're not safe there. They flee into Boston. And this is increasingly happening in the fall of 74 and early 75, as you have people in these towns suddenly stop liking their neighbors because their neighbors are still too sympathetic to the British crown. And their neighbors are okay with our power to govern ourselves being taken away. So you have this powder alarm in Medford that precipitates then this riot in Cambridge and an attack on loyalists in Cambridge. And what you see happening then are two things. One, loyalists in the surrounding towns are going into Boston where they can be protected by the British troops. Two, in Boston itself, occupied by the British troops, you have people who want to be patriots leaving. Getting out of town, because now you have several thousand British troops arriving, and it's difficult for you to be a patriot in Boston. Isaiah Thomas is a printer, not at this time a basketball player, and he has a printing press. He spirits that out of town, and he takes it first to Watertown and then out to Worcester, and he publishes a newspaper called the Massachusetts Spy. So you have patriots leaving Boston, loyalists coming into Boston, and this whole crisis seems to be engulfing the entire province one way or another. Okay. Are there any questions on this so far? Any ideas what you might do if you're General Gage? You don't want to, neither side really wants to start a war. What Gage is trying to do is disarm people in the countryside. So if there is a war, they won't be able to fight. What he wants is for people to say, okay, we'll want to go along with British rule and not have armed rebellion against British rule. We don't like having the troops here, and maybe we can get Parliament to back off. In fact, in the fall of 1774, there is an election for Parliament, and there is some thinking that if the opposition wins this election, they'll turn out the ministry of Lord North that has brought on this whole crisis. And people refer to the troops as the ministerial troops because they're sent here by the British ministry. And what we want is for the Crown to acknowledge that we can govern ourselves as part of the British Empire, that our assembly, which has now been suspended, stands in the same relationship to us as the British Parliament stands in relationship to the people of England. That's kind of part of the hope here. Meanwhile, Gage is still trying to pacify the province by disarming it. He also learns in early December that at Fort William and Mary in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, there's a stockpile of weapons. So he sends a force up there to get the weapons from Fort William and Mary. But this time, the Patriots hear about this, and they send a messenger up to Fort William and Mary, or up to Portsmouth. These British forts typically would have a dozen or so soldiers, because if there's any real danger, what those soldiers will do is call on the local militia. The British regulars are just there as kind of a force to keep the fort in operation until the militia can be summoned. But now what happens is the messenger arrives, the town militia takes on the fort. They outnumber the guys in the fort, and certainly the officer of the fort doesn't want to fight against the local militia. So the fort surrenders to the local militia, and they get the weapons and things out before Gage's forces can arrive and take them. That's in December. In February, there's another expedition up to Salem, and this is led by a Colonel Alexander Leslie. And Leslie lands in Marblehead, marches over to Salem. It's a Sunday. And once this ship has arrived with British troops, actually one of the guys in the local militia who knows Leslie marches past Leslie, salutes Leslie, and Leslie knows him because this guy's in the militia. And this guy goes into Salem and tells the militia there, Leslie's on his way to take the weapons. And so they go and hide the weapons. And they also, there's a drawbridge between Marblehead and Salem. They pull it up. That will stall Leslie. And to Sunday, the minister from the church comes out and he negotiates with Leslie because he doesn't want to have a fight start here in Salem on a Sunday afternoon in February. And Leslie also doesn't want to have a fight start. And Leslie says, I'm ordered to march over here and search for weapons. And the minister says, how far do you have to march? He says, well, I need to go like 200 yards. And the minister says, okay, how about if we let you go 200 yards and then you turn around and go home? You can tell, and I don't think he actually says that, but they know. Leslie can go back to Gage and say, yeah, I went there, I marched, didn't see anything. The town can say, well, we didn't start a war. So this is what happens in Salem as Leslie does. They put down the bridge, Leslie and his men march across it, and they don't see anything. They turn around and go back to their ships, come back to Boston. February, sun sets kind of early. They don't want to be out after dark and sailing back to Boston after dark. Each side is really trying to avoid an armed conflict. Now, we'll back up a minute because I mentioned that in June of 1774, the Assembly or the Provincial Congress was electing delegates to go to a Continental Congress that met in Philadelphia. And that meets in the fall of 1774 in Philadelphia. This is a meeting of delegates from all of the American colonies. And some of them, I should say, there are very few in this meeting who think that these American colonies can or should declare independence. What they really want to see happening is the British government saying, we've really pushed things too far. We don't want to have a war in America. We don't want these people to be upset. So let's cut the taxes and not say we have the power to tax them. That's kind of what a lot of people are hoping. they're still thinking that we're subjects of the king. It's Parliament that has overstepped. Now, it's unclear how this meeting is going to decide. Some of them may say, Boston really brought this on themselves. I mean, people in Boston are a bunch of religious fanatics who think that they control everything, and you really can't trust them. And sure, they should have their port shut down for destroying the tea and otherwise acting so belligerently. You know, think about this. None of the delegates to the convention, to the Congress from Boston had ever been as far as New York. None of the delegates from New York had ever been to Boston. None of the Virginians had ever been to Boston, and none of the Bostonians had ever been to Virginia. These are very different places, and there isn't a lot they have in common. You know, Virginia, all of the delegates to the Congress from Virginia are fairly wealthy slave owners. And John Adams and the other delegates from Massachusetts are farmers, or in one or two cases, merchants. And you don't have that kind of we all see eye to eye. They had read some things that other people had written. That is, there are some folks who had been writing things about the British rule from other places. So they kind of knew what people were saying, but there wasn't a whole lot they had in common. And so there's a big risk for Boston in having this Congress because they don't have a lot in common with these folks from other places. And maybe they will say, we don't like these Puritan fanatics. Another thing that happens, let me just tell you one story about something that happens in Parliament. As Parliament's also discussing why things are going so badly in Boston particularly. One British writer said that the king had Boston on the brain. And a member of Parliament says he had been to Boston. He had knocked on a door of a house. A servant had answered, opened the door, and the man said, "I'm here to see your master." And this young woman said to him, "I have no master but Jesus Christ." Well, this is absurd if you're English, that this woman, who clearly is a servant in this household, doesn't see herself as a servant to anyone but Jesus Christ. There are all these religious fanatics who think that everyone is just as good as everyone else in the eyes of God, and how can you possibly govern these people? And certainly the Virginians don't see that they have a lot in common with these wacky Puritans from Boston. And John Adams, who's traveling to, it's the first time he's been out of Massachusetts, writes in his diary about how different these places are. In New York, he says, the people, they'll ask you a question, and before you've gotten 3 words of your answer out, they've asked you another one. I mean, they're just really pushy people who keep talking. Philadelphia, he said, it's a very grand city. It is, in fact, the biggest city in North America, and it has the second busiest port in the British Empire. But Adams says, there are no real gentlemen here. And another thing that Philadelphia has a lot of that Boston doesn't is churches. Now, you know, Boston does have a lot of churches, but they're all congregational churches. In Philadelphia, not only is there is a congregational church, there's also a Presbyterian church, there's a Quaker meeting house, there's an Anglican church, there's a synagogue, and there's also a Catholic church. It's the only place in the British Empire where there is a Catholic church that can, where Catholics can worship openly. So this is really different. And along with the delegation from Massachusetts has arrived at Philadelphia a man named Isaac Backus. And Backus, from the town of Middleborough in Massachusetts, he's a Baptist minister. Baptists in Massachusetts pay taxes to support the Congregational church. Everyone in Massachusetts pays taxes to support the Congregational Church, whether they are Congregationalists or not. And Backus has come to the Congress wanting the Congress to tell the Massachusetts Provincial Congress to stop taxing the Baptists to support the Congregational Church. What would you say if you were Congress to Mr. Backus? Bearing in mind, every member of the Massachusetts Provincial Congress is a Congregationalist, but not every member of the Congress, the Continental Congress, is a Baptist or a Congregationalist. You know, then in Massachusetts, the Congregationalists have a religious establishment. They don't in the other colonies. And here, if Massachusetts wants the other colonies to go along with them, they have to somehow appease the Baptists, which isn't something they want to do. Anyway, complicated story here. And what the Congress decides to do, not in the case of the Baptists, that's another story, is they draft a petition to the king saying, lighten up, tell the parliament to lighten up on us. And they also call on the other colonies to support Massachusetts not having its charter suspended, trade suspended, and so on. And so they want to have the parliament lighten up. They send a petition to the king and they say, okay, we'll meet again next May. That is in May of 1775. By that time, we'll have an answer from the king and parliament to our petition. So that's where we left things with the Congress. Meanwhile, our friend General Gage is trying to take weapons away from the people in New England so they can't carry on this war against the British Crown. Any questions so far? Okay. February of 1775, in addition to Leslie's retreat, you have Parliament meeting, and Parliament decides, really, we want to get a little bit tougher on these New Englanders. So they think Gage really isn't up to the job. Maybe a show of a little more force would tip the balance and get this silly rebellion to end. So Parliament votes to send more troops to Massachusetts. In addition, we're going to replace Gage with a better general. The new general will be William Howe. And in addition to Howe, they send over two more generals, Burgoyne and Clinton, and new orders to try to, they really want to try to end this rebellion before it gets bigger. So that's kind of the thinking as Parliament sends these troops off to New England in March or so. New orders to Gage, keep trying to disarm these folks, and hopefully that will end their resistance. Okay. Before these guys get here, before the new generals get here, in April of 1775, Gage realizes the Massachusetts Provincial Congress is stockpiling a lot of weapons in the town of Concord. Concord is about 20 miles or so west of Boston. Okay, so Boston, here, the Shawmut Peninsula, Charlestown here. Okay, this is Noddle's Island. Cambridge. Charles River. Roxbury, excuse me, Dorchester, and roughly okay. So Concord is about here. This is where the colonists are stockpiling weapons. The Provincial Congress is also met out there. It's the Shire town, or one of the Shire towns of Middlesex County. So the thinking is that Gage will send a force out there to get this stuff. And this is part of his further, what he has been doing, which is, taking the weapons away in Medford, and the weapons in Portsmouth, and the weapons in Salem. This is yet another of these expeditions to gather weapons that are being stockpiled by the colonists. And word gets out that this is what is in the offing. It's difficult to keep a secret like this in Boston because you have to get the troops prepared, and you then have to send them. And there are two ways of sending them. One is this way, by land, across Boston Neck, through Roxbury, into Cambridge, or the other way, many of the troops are camped here on Boston Common, send them across the river, and this way, under ideal circumstances, would be faster. But of course, you have to get 800 or so soldiers into boats, get them across here, and it's not, these things will always look easier on paper than when they're in operation. Okay? And Gage has prepared this for the expedition itself. Will go on the plan is that around dawn on the 19th of April, this column of 800 men will have come to Concord, catch them by surprise, take the weapons, march back to Boston, and thus further disarm these people in the countryside. That's the plan, okay? Word, though, gets out that that is the plan. And so on the night of April the 18th, messengers are sent out. One, William Dawes, goes this way. There are British sentries at Boston Neck. He goes, and actually another thing Gage is looking for is this. Someone had been able to take some cannon that are at this fort at the battery in the north end of Boston. These 4 cannon had been taken from the fort there, and they had snuck them out of town along this route, and now those cannon are out in Concord. Gage doesn't want these people to have cannon for obvious reasons. Do you know how they snuck them out? If you're a British sentry, your job here at Boston Neck is to make sure no one is leaving town with cannon, which are heavy things, hard to disguise, and it seems like a fairly easy thing to prevent happening, right? Another thing that has happened in a town like Boston is, this is a rather delicate thing to bring up with a genteel group like this, but there's no sewage system in Boston. If you have a house, well, there are privies behind houses. Privies are, basically stone holes in the ground, lined with stone, and over the long range of time, the stuff in them will decompose. However, that takes time. So sometimes the privies get filled up, and thus you have people whose job it's a business, to go dig out privies, load the stuff into a wagon, and then cart it out to the countryside because this stuff also can be used as fertilizer. There's a big connection between the growth of cities and the development of an agricultural sector. In fact, one of my colleagues in the history department wrote about this happening in China in the 19th century. And the people who shovel out the privies are called night soil men. And this is called night soil. It's a euphemism for what it actually is. So I'm thinking you can anticipate how we got the cannon out of Boston. We put them into wagons filled with night soil, and a British sentry is not going to want to dig through that to see if there might be a cannon in this wagon filled with night soil. So the cannon now cleaned off are out and conquered, and Gage wants to send these troops to go get them. Okay. So word had gone out. This messenger, William Dawes, goes this way, and then Paul Revere over in Charlestown goes this way, and this is one of the most famous stories in American history, and I feel badly not telling it to you in full detail. There is the poem about Paul Revere's ride that Henry Wadsworth Longfellow wrote in 1860. Do you know this poem, Ahad? Okay. Amber, do you know this poem?
I think so. You know, obviously, I remember I read it in 5th grade.
Okay. Yes, so same thing. Yeah. So anyway, the Old North Church, tallest building in town. And so what Revere wants to know, he's already over in Charlestown waiting to go. But what he wants to know is, are the British planning to march this way, or are they planning to go by boat this way? Because it'll take a different amount of time. So when he brings the word, it will mean, are they going to be here at 7 a.m. or are they going to be here at noon? So listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere. 'Twas the 18th of April of 75. Hardly a man is now alive who remembers that fateful day and year. He said to his friend, if the British march by land or sea from the town tonight, hang a lantern aloft from the belfry arch of the Old North Church as a signal light. One, if by land, and two, and I on the opposite shore will be ready to ride and spread the alarm through every Middlesex village and farm for the country folk to be up and to arm. Famous poem, and I could go on, but you get the idea. He knows in each town who he is supposed to alert. That is, each town, as I said, has a militia force. And so he knows which door to knock on and say, the regulars are marching, or the regulars are out. And it happens, they get the word because the fellow who puts the lanterns up had seen the British going down to the common, getting boats ready. So it's a sign they're going by boat, okay? And Revere, meanwhile, and Dawes are out alerting people. And the whole expedition of the British to get across the back bay takes longer than they thought. They get to the opposite shore. The tide has gone out. They can't get right up to the shore. They have to get out of their boats, walk. Sometimes they're up to their hips in the water. They're going through this marshy, muddy area, slogging ashore. And as the British troops are now slogging ashore early in the morning of April the 19th, they can already hear church bells ringing in the surrounding towns. That's a signal for the militia to get up, or that there is some alarm. So they kind of know the word is out that they're on the march. So the whole element of surprise is gone. And however, these 800 or so men head out to Concord. And the town on this side of Concord is Lexington. Lexington, the militia had gotten the alarm sometime around midnight. And so they had been up since midnight waiting for the British to come. They gathered in a tavern. First they had mustered on the town green. Nothing happened. They go to the tavern. Some of them go home. They're waiting all night. And about 7 the next morning, someone reports seeing a column of, or 700 British soldiers now, about half a mile outside of town. So the Lexington militia gathers on Lexington Green, and the British come into the town and onto the green, and here are these rebels standing between them and their objective, which is Concord. And there's kind of a standoff. Neither side really knows what to do. And the officer in charge of the British column says something to the effect of, "Disperse, you damned rebels, get out of the way." And the captain of the Lexington militia, Captain William Prescott, Thomas Parker, is telling his men to disperse when someone fires a gun. To this day, we don't know who. It did come from behind the British line. The British insisted they did not fire. However, now they've ordered these rebels to disperse. Someone has fired, and the British opened fire on the Lexington militia, killing about 7 or 8 of them, and the rest now disperse. And then the British, having gotten them to move, which is what they wanted, move on to their real objective, which is the town of Concord, about 6 or so miles away from Lexington. Now, in Concord, there were several mustering points for the militia. Let me just see if I can give you a little more detail on this. And remember, the objective in Concord is to find these weapons that the rebels have been stockpiling and then get back to Boston. So it's now, about 8 a.m. or so on the 19th of April, and the British are marching out to Concord. There is a ridge here, and in the town of Concord, the Concord River flows this way. It's a very slow-moving river. In fact, if you look at it, you can't tell which way it's going. And the town of Concord is roughly here. And north of the town, there is a bridge over the Concord River. South of town, another bridge over the Concord River. And the British officer in charge of this dispatches one group to guard the South Bridge, make sure if there are any rebel militia, they don't get across. And another one, not only to guard the North Bridge, but to cross the North Bridge, because up the hill from the bridge at the farm of Colonel Barrett, and Colonel Barrett is the commander of the local militia. And his farm, they know, they've been hiding weapons. So he sends a force to search the Barrett house for weapons. Of course, Colonel Barrett knows they're coming to look for weapons at my house. He is taking care to hide them all. In fact, knowing that the militia, knowing that they're on their way, and they had gotten the word around 1 a.m. the previous night, they had had about 7 hours now to hide the weapons. So the British column crosses the bridge, searches the Barrett house, doesn't find anything. Meanwhile, another British group in the town of Concord has also been searching for weapons, and they have found some. And in front of the town meeting house, they start a fire of the gun carriages and other things they have found. The gun carriages are the pieces of wood that hold a cannon up. So they've started a fire here. Meanwhile, Colonel Smith and his group come back across the bridge, and now militia from surrounding towns are arriving here near the Barrett farm, which is their muster place. That is, these militia knew when there's a danger, we muster at a certain place. She's not constantly calling saying, where was it we were supposed to meet? You know, this is where you meet. So the militia from Acton and Lincoln and other towns are gathering here near the Barrett farm. Smith is holding the bridge, and in the town of Concord, you have the British expedition burning the gun carriages. So, what does all of this have to do with the beginning of the war? This is what happens. These guys are gathering up here. Down in Concord, and we're on a hillside here, north of the town. If you go there today, there are going to be a lot of trees. You won't be able to see the town. There weren't that many trees in 1775. Plus, it is April, which means if there are trees, they're not going to have many leaves on them. And what we see is a big column of smoke rising out of Concord. In fact, this fire they started in front of the meeting house almost catches the meeting house on fire. What we don't see is that in the town, the British soldiers and townspeople now are putting the fire out. What we see is an increasing tower of smoke rising from the town of Concord. What do we think that might be? Oh, you men from the militia of Acton and Lincoln and Sudbury and these other surrounding towns, or from up here, where this is your town. You might think they've set the town on fire. Is that going to get you upset? Aha, you seem very level-headed. You see, this force has marched into town, they're burning it down. You would say, well, live and let live, maybe. That gets them kind of upset. And we want to go into the town and drive them out. Now, the commander of the militia here doesn't want to cross the bridge because there's a British force there, and we're not going to get into the town before we get into a fight with this British force holding the bridge. And what happens here, well, by the way, we also don't know what had happened in Lexington now an hour and a half ago, that the British had encountered this militia force from Lexington and left about 7 or 8 of them dead. And what happens here is the militia does open fire on Colonel Smith's group holding this bridge. Now, there's a gunfight between Smith's men and these Americans on the other side of the bridge. And Smith, realizing there's really no point in holding the bridge anymore, starts retreating. Because their job isn't to cross the bridge now and get into a fight with this militia. They start pulling back. Now, of course, if you are the militia from Sudbury, Acton, Lincoln, and you're on this side of the bridge, you've just started firing at this British force on the other side of the bridge, and what's the British force doing now? They're retreating. So what does that indicate to you? Go ahead and go to Concord, because the British Army at this point has done something we have never seen them do before, which is retreat. So now this militia force starts following them. And the other thing that has happened, as I said, this alarm had gone out that the British are marching to Concord. And here you see there are men from Acton, Lincoln, Sudbury. There also are militia forces coming from Dracut and from southern New Hampshire and from Rhode Island and from Connecticut. These men have been on the march as soon as they got the word. Back in the fall, they had started minute companies. So say you have, the town militia has 1,000 men. You have made 100 of them into a minute company that can be ready at a minute's notice to go off in case of any danger. So these forces have been on the march, and they're coming knowing somewhere between Concord and Boston, there is some kind of trouble. So these forces are arriving throughout the day. And this British force in Concord, having put out the fire, having captured the weapons it needed or was looking for, starts marching back to Boston from Concord. And as they are marching, more of these troops are arriving on the scene to attack. And the Americans aren't fighting the way the British do. The British Army, very well trained, very well armed. They wear bright red uniforms so that you can see them coming. Their purpose is, well, I guess you could call it shock and awe. You see these guys coming who are going to march in a straight line and just keep coming and march right over you. They want you to see them because your instinct is going to be, when you do see them, not to hang around and see what they're going to do. These guys know that. So they are basically ambushing these British troops as they're marching back to Boston. And they're hiding behind walls. They're hiding behind farmhouses and trees. That poem I started before, the last verse, you know the rest. In the books you have read, how the British regulars fired and fled, how the farmers gave them ball for ball from behind each barn and farmyard wall, chasing the British down the lane, crossing the fields to emerge again under the trees at the edge of the road, only pausing to fire and load. So the British are fighting against a force that knows this area very well and is also using what to the British are unconventional tactics. They're fighting the way the Indians would fight. That is, you fire and then you retreat. And the heaviest fighting that day doesn't happen in Lexington or Concord. It happens in the town of Menotomy, which is now the town of Arlington, because this is where the British column, and by the way, these guys had been on the march since about 10 or 11 the previous night. Now it's about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and they haven't stopped to eat or to rest, and now they are under the heaviest attack they've been, most of them any time in their military career. And so the town of Menotomy is where they have the most casualties as men are coming from all over. Now, Gage had realized that there might be trouble, so he had sent a relief column under Lord Percy. He had actually sent Percy this message at about 10 o'clock the previous night. For some reason, Percy doesn't get the word until 8 in the morning that he is supposed to go to the relief of this expedition going to Concord. But Percy is able to mobilize pretty quickly, gets his forces. He doesn't go by water, he goes this way, gets here to Cambridge. There's a bridge over the Charles River, which the Patriots had taken apart. Percy is able to put it back together again. And just as this force is getting slaughtered in Menotomy, Percy comes on the scene and he has some cannon he is able to use to disperse the rebels and gets the rest of this British force into Charlestown. By this time, it's about 4 in the afternoon. Both sides are exhausted. The Americans aren't going to pursue them anymore. The British now are in Charlestown, and they realize there now are somewhere between 10 and 20,000 militiamen camping from Cambridge down to Roxbury. They're holding the British in Boston. So the previous day, General Gage had sent out this expedition to disarm the rebels, take away their weapons, prevent them from fighting. On this day, the end of the 19th of April, Gage and his, maybe 8 or 10,000 troops are besieged in Boston by somewhere between 10 and 20,000 militia troops. This is a huge change from the previous day. You have militia from Massachusetts, from Rhode Island, Connecticut, and New Hampshire now surrounding the British Army in Boston. Fortunately, the British have ships in the harbor, but they're really stuck. So this is the beginning of what we call the Siege of Boston, as the British Army holds Boston and this rebel militia force controls the rest of the countryside. Any questions? Okay. Now, remember, Boston, relatively small area. And the things that the British don't have in Boston are access to firewood, which is essential for cooking, and access to any kind of fresh food. I already mentioned the whole privy problem, but also Boston really depended on the agricultural productions of the surrounding towns. Dorchester, Roxbury, Charlestown, so on. Farmers there in these farm towns bringing their goods to market in Boston. And this is how Boston was fed. The islands in the harbor, Noddle's Island, Hog Island, Castle Island is a fort, but then you have Long Island, Spectacle Island. These are grazing grounds. In fact, Noddle's Island is the principal grazing area for Boston's sheep, cattle, and pigs. This is why it's called Hog Island. This is now East Boston. So you have all of this livestock out here, and of course, the British need livestock because they are now surrounded by an army. There's not a whole lot of livestock in Boston. Also not a whole lot of firewood. So what they do for firewood is fairly straightforward. They cut down all of the available trees in Boston, as well as knocking down some old churches which are no longer in use. One is the North Meeting House that was the Mathers old church. Other churches, they take out the pews to burn them. You know, and this may sound really mean-spirited, but you spend a winter in Boston without heat, and you'll certainly look at an abandoned church differently. Now, in early May, this militia force in Cambridge realizes the British could get all of the sheep and cattle on Noddle's Island, but what we can do is prevent that from happening. By the way, other islands produce hay, which the British need to feed their horses. And so in May, an expedition goes to Noddle's Island to drive off all the cattle and sheep, or kill the ones they can't drive off, driving them to Hog Island and then across to what is now Chelsea. In fact, this was called Chelsea Creek. And they also set fire to a farmhouse on Noddle's Island, which alerts the British that something is up over there. The British send a small ship, the Diana, up Chelsea Creek to try to fire on the rebels on Noddle's Island. The problem with this is Noddle's Island is a hill, which is where you're firing. You're on a ship, and the ship really can't fire that high. They do send some Marines ashore. About 8 or 10 Marines are killed in this expedition as the livestock's driven off of Noddle's Island and Hog Island, and the ship firing on the Americans ashore. And the Americans also have brought a cannon here to the ferry dock in Chelsea. So the ship goes to fire at the ferry dock. And one thing the British commander did not know was how the tide operates here. And the Diana winds up getting stuck on the bottom of Chelsea Creek as the tide goes out. And now the Americans have a cannon, they fire at the Diana, and the British abandon ship, a number of their officers and sailors killed in what is the first naval capture of the American Revolution. This is in May of 1775. So why don't we leave it at that? And I'm thinking that what we will do on Thursday, well, I'll tell you what we will do on Thursday before we meet. Probably do some work on the common public garden, but why don't we call it a day? I'll leave you wondering what happens next after the Diana runs aground, the British hold up in Boston, and the 20 or so thousand militia troops gathering on the shore. Okay?